I really appreciate everybody tuning in today. It's a pleasure to share this study with you. What I'm going to be sharing today is dozens of new fire histories that have been collected in the Western Cascades in Oregon and Washington, and also in the Oregon Coast Range. I think that these histories are going to give us a refined understanding of historical fire regimes in temperate rainforests in the Pacific Northwest. Before I begin, I think it would be helpful for me to sort of map out why I wanted to share this with the LANDFIRE community. In the past, as a dendroecologist, I've done fire reconstructions in Central Oregon in lodgepole forests, dry mixed conifer forests, and each time we go out and collect empirical data, that gives us an opportunity to refine our understanding of a fire regime and then feed that into models like the LANDFIRE models. So I've done that in the past with Corey Blankenship, and it's been great to have that opportunity to put your work to use. And I think in this study, we sort of have a pretty special case for two reasons. And the first reason is that our models for fire in the Pacific Northwest, west of the Cascades, are really based on hypotheses and expert opinion that hasn't been tested by cross-dated fire scars. So there hasn't been a lot of that work done there. And so I think we're going to have a really big shift in how we think about historical fire in the Pacific Northwest. So that's going to be a big deal. The second part is that there's behaviors and properties of this fire regime that I haven't seen before. So I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts on that variability in this fire regime and how we model it and live with it, not just in models, but in the real world. So just a little bit more housekeeping. My format for the presentation today, I think it's appropriate to do a brief introduction to tree ring science. The next part of the presentation is going to talk about how we got to our hypothesis about fire in the Pacific Northwest and why it's limited. And then I'll get into the interesting part, which is the new data. And then finally, I want to close with a discussion of traditional burning and indigenous knowledge and how important that is in the Pacific Northwest. So here I'll get started. So I'm a dendroecologist. That means I'm really interested in going to forests like this forest in the picture and understanding how it came to be. We've clear cut a lot of these forests. We have climate change coming. So if we want to preserve the forests we have and recruit them in the future, it's really important to know how this old growth forest and other old growth forests developed. What I'm showing you here is a forest in the Willamette National Forest at about 4,000 feet of elevation. It gets about 70 inches of precipitation a year. And you can see that there's this old growth cohort established in the late 1500s. There's other cohorts of Douglas-fir and hemlock that have come into the stand. There's snags and logs, and then there's this big opening. And so this work is all about understanding how that came to be with tree ring science over time. So the methods that we're using here are pretty straightforward. There's a comic about what dendroecologists or fire ecologists are obsessed with. We like to find old stumps and logs, cut cross sections out of them, and find fire scars on them. So that's how we're learning about fire. And then, of course, when we have live trees, we're removing tree cores from them to learn about when they established and how that establishment was related to past fire and other disturbances. I think it's important to relay that in this work today, all of the samples are cross-dating. What cross-dating does is it assigns each tree ring in a sample to the exact calendar year in which it formed. This is something that wasn't done in the Western Cascades or Coast Range in previous work. And I think it's one of our big limitations today. So cross-dating basically takes down the climate signal that's in every tree. And that climate signal is the product of wet years and dry years. So it's like you'd expect. A wet year produces a fat ring and a hot, dry year produces a skinny ring. So in this example here, you can see the year 1757, where I have the pointer now, is a real skinny ring with real skinny latewood, and that's a severe drought year. And you can look across samples collected over a broad area, and you find that ring every time. So we're using this process to make sure every fire scar we collect and every tree establishment date we produce is dated to the exact year. And that's how we can sample out of things that have been dead for a really long time. Second piece of information you need to know is we've worked hard to understand what cambial fire scars are and be sure that what we're recording as fire scars come from fire. Right now, I'm showing you a fire scar in the year 1659, and there's some very diagnostic features that tell us this is a fire scar. A fire scar forms because fire moves past the base of a tree. It heats through the bark. It's not physically burning the wood in the tree, but it transmits lethal heat through the bark, and that kills the cambium in one spot on the tree. So that's what's happened here. And what's characteristic is it's a very, very clean wound. If you had tree-on-tree violence or mechanical damage from animals or other sources, a wound in a tree will go across tree rings. These fire scars sit neatly on top of one cell layer when you look at them under a microscope. Other diagnostic features is they have a curl over or wound wood that covers up that dead cambium right where it died. And then what's really important on Douglas fir is finding this really characteristic resin that's really dark, and that occurs only where the cambium was killed. So it just follows where that cambium was killed on Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest. So that's an example of fire scars, and you'll see lots of those represented on graphs today. That's the background for tree ring research. Now I'm going to move on to how we came to sort of the predominant understanding of fire and succession in Douglas fir forest in the Pacific Northwest. What I'm sharing here is a beautiful diagram of forest development from a young forest to an old growth forest. This model and diagram was tremendously important to forest conservation in the Northwest Forest Plan. What it really is stating is that there's a high severity fire. Afterwards, a cohort of Douglas fir establishes. You have small gap processes and disturbances occurring as that Douglas fir cohort is competing with each other. And so trees start to fall and die out of the stand. And from those gaps, you get the initiation of an understory tree canopy. And over time, that within stand process that's not fire proceeds to make a very multi-layered and complex forest. This model is true. It absolutely happens, but it's one of many ways to get old growth in the Pacific Northwest. And what we're finding is it's far more common to have non-stand replacing fire repeatedly occurring as you move from a young forest to an old growth forest, and it contributes a lot of the diversity in these forests. But this is sort of what you're taught as a student and what a lot of people have in their minds as the model for old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. So why is that such a dominant view? I think a lot of it has to do with east winds and mega fires in the Pacific Northwest. As you're all probably aware, we just experienced the 2020 Labor Day fires. Really high wind speeds, super low humidity, and high temperatures drive these big patches of stand replacing fire in the Pacific Northwest. And they happened in 2020, 1933, 1902, and several of them in the 1800s. So these are really extreme events. They're seared into people's mind, and they sort of dominate how we think about forest dynamics in the Pacific Northwest. And I think it's perhaps masked a lot of the work that low and moderate severity fire happening at much more frequent intervals contributed to the ecology and development of old forests in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to close this section with one last talk about how I think we're a little bit off in the Pacific Northwest. So on the left, I'm showing you a figure from a really good recent paper by Jens Stevens. What the authors did in this paper is they mapped fire regimes from fire resistance traits of different species. And then they compared that to the LANDFIRE estimates for fire return interval. And over much of the Western United States, the fire resistance scores and the fire return intervals were a pretty good match. But there's a couple paragraphs in this paper where they're really talking about the curious mismatch in the Pacific Northwest, where they're saying we have high fire resistance scores in the Western Cascades and Coast Range, but we have a really long predicted fire return interval. And so I think what's going on here is Douglas fir is telling us something about the diversity and frequency of historical fire in the area. So Douglas fir is this species that's actually really fire resistant as a mature tree. It self prunes. It's got all these capabilities to withstand pretty high intensity fire. And if it does happen to burn at high severity, it also has the adaptations to recover after that. So I sort of think of Douglas fir as this tree with a whole suite or Swiss Army knife of adaptations to be adapted to fire. And so as we dig into the fire regime, what we're seeing is that there's all sorts of fire regimes where this tree exists: frequent low severity, moderately frequent mixed severity, and infrequent high. And it's sort of the fire adaptive traits of Douglas fir are speaking to that in the region. Why hasn't this type of dendroecology reconstruction of historical fires occurred? You know, if you read papers from the 90s and early 2000s, there's these challenges about doing fire history reconstructions. When you have large scars and you're in a moist environment, they may rot, so you can't cover them. It's a very productive place. So the thought is that if you have small fire scars on trees, they're going to be healed and you can't find them. Douglas fir, as I mentioned, has really fire-resistant bark, so maybe when fires occur, they're not going to record them. All of that adds up to, it's going to take a ton of labor and time to go out there and cut cross sections out of these forests and put together a fire history. And if our model already is that fire is infrequent and standard placing, why would we go through the process of sectioning all these stumps all over the place to reconstruct the historical fire regime? Despite this sort of perception, there was a lot of people, Peter Weisberg, Peter Morrison, Fred Swanson, and Alan Tepley, who did tree ring counts on stumps, and they were really trying to get a handle on how forests established and developed and how fire was a prominent feature in the Western Cascades. And they did say, you know, there's a huge role for non-standard placing fire in this region, but they didn't have cross-dated fire scars. They didn't take the samples out of the forest. And so some really important limitations of that. If you field date something, you're going to have a large error, could be 25 years off on your dating for fire scars. When you can't date fires to the exact year, you can't do things like relate fire occurrence to climate. You're not going to get a good estimate of fire size or fire frequency when you have a coarse dating methodology. One other tactic that was used was to understand fire was to use establishment dates. And since we've been doing this work, we've realized that less than a third of the fires that occur in a forest are actually reflected by tree establishment dates. So there's all sorts of missing data about fire here. And I put this photo up here just to have people try to imagine how hard it would be to correctly identify and date fire scars if you were doing this in the field on stumps. This is a picture of a stump that I cut the top off of, so it's a relatively fresh cut. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 fire scars pictured, and then you can see the establishment date at the bottom of the photo. I want you to imagine how hard it would be to find those fire scars and accurately count all the rings from the outside of a 500-year-old tree. So they were finding this evidence, but it was really hard to robustly quantify. So moving on to today's work, we decided that we would start working in the Southwest Cascades and then eventually move our way up through other national forests in the Western Cascades. And now we're working in the Coast Range on the Elliot State Forest. And what we're doing is cutting the cross sections off the stumps, bringing them back to the lab and cross-dating them. Just a little bit of information on how these fire histories are new and different compared to existing fire histories. Right now, I'm showing you a graph of Western US environmental space. Precipitation is on the y-axis and temperatures on the x-axis, and then all the points represent that climactic space. The Pacific Northwest sits in sort of the area I'm circling with the mouse right now. Next, this is just a map of those density, those precipitation and temperature regimes in the Western US. So now I'm showing you the previously published fire histories from the North American Fire Scar Network. So all those fire histories are represented in that climactic space by red triangles. And this next slide shows you where these new west side fire histories have gone in. So we're sampling a climactic space that has not been sampled with cross-dated fire reconstruction methods before. So we really haven't had this information before. So this is new territory for tree rig research. Just a shot of what this looks like in the field. We've got Sky, Anna, and Micah working really hard to section these old rotting stumps. A shot of what that looks like at one site at the end of the day. So that's what's going into the truck from one site. Typically, we cut 15 to 20 cross sections from a site to reconstruct the fire history. And you can see lots of fire scars showing up on those Douglas-fir samples that come out of a rainforest, essentially. So now I'm there. I'm going to get you guys into the data finally. What you're seeing here is that's fire scar in 1659, and I want to walk you guys through how I'm going to represent this graphically. Circles on graphs are going to indicate the pith date or establishment date of a tree. Triangles that are red are going to indicate fire years, and then each tree in a graph is going to have a timeline that extends from its innermost ring to its outermost ring. So here's an example graph for one site. What you can see is a group of trees that established probably after a severe fire around 1776. A cohort comes in, and then you can see red triangles indicating a fire year in 1812. So that's an example of a history for one stand. And now I'm going to walk through several different examples. So I'm going to start with a site in the Pacific Silver Fir Zone. This would be an area that gets a wintertime snowpack. It's on the cool, wet side. And I start with this site because it really fits our expected hypothesis or model for old growth development in the Pacific Northwest. So first graph here. This graph is showing you the group of trees we sampled at this site. Most of them are established probably after a severe fire around 1260. So really old trees. We cut lots of samples from trees at this site, and we only picked up one fire scar in the year 1492. So this really fits our model of infrequent high severity being the model to develop your old growth forest. Just let you guys look at that for a little bit longer. Now I'm going to move into something on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a site that burned at high severity in the Labor Day fires in 2020. It's just east of Salem or Detroit, Oregon, if you know where that's at. As you go over the pass up the Cascades, it was logged because it was next to the highway, so there was danger with trees falling down on the road. So it gave us really fresh stumps to do a reconstruction with. And this is the history for that site. So we see evidence that there might have been a high severity fire right before 1650, and a cohort of Douglas-fir establishes. Then in the next 50 years, you see 2 reburns on that site, followed by another fire in the early 1700s. And then we get another cohort of trees in the early 1700s. You can see lots of triangles thereafter. This site is burning chronically. And then we get another cohort of trees in the early 1800s. So what we had here is a multi-age old growth stand of Douglas-fir that had chronic or regular low and moderate severity fire after a high severity fire. So it's a very different fire regime than expected for the region. I will say that we tend to find these sort of in the mid to lower elevations, and often next to major rivers. So places that a lot of people would move through historically. Meant to bring up these arrows, but the arrows are just indicating the different tree cohorts that I see in this stand. So 1650, around 1700, and then another one in 1800. So lots of shade intolerant age classes at that site. Next, I'm going to move to site 23, the site I started the presentation about. How did this come about over time? This has sort of been the moist and cooler zone, not quite the silver fir zone, but a more productive, cooler, wetter site. This site established probably after a severe fire around 1560. You can see there's an initial cohort there. And then in the next 100 years, there's 3 reburns of that site. So if you looked at fire frequency from 1550 to about 1675, it's quite frequent. There's 4 fires at least in that time. What's really interesting about sites in this zone is they often have periods of really frequent fire after the new forest established, and then they have a long time period, in this case, over 100 years from 1675 to 1812 with no fire. So we have 5 fires in a century. We have over a fire with no fires detected, even though we have lots of trees that could record fire sampled. And then we have a fire in 1812 and a fire and a severe drought in 1849 at the site. So this is sort of a really interesting type of situation because you see dynamic fire frequency over time. There's periods where fire is quite frequent and there's periods where fire is infrequent. So now I'm going to scale up to lots of sites all at once. This is our 24 sites sampled across the Willamette National Forest. And the reason we do this is just to show the variability in historical fire frequency and forest development that happens within a relatively small geographic area. So we tend to lump things and take forest zones and say it has this fire regime history. But what you're going to see among these 24 sites is a lot of diversity in the historical fire regime. So these are these 24 sites. Sorry, this graph is a lot to wade through, but site 92 is one site, and you can see the trees that were sampled there and that one fire that we reconstructed in 1492 and no other fires. So if you look at site 92, you can compare it to site 82, which has a very different history. The older trees are much younger at that site, and then you can see that it has a much, much higher historical fire frequency up into about 1850. And then there's less fire at that site after 1850. So just scanning up and down, you can see lots of different behaviors. You can see sites that have more fire early in their development, long gaps without fire, and then fire in the 1800s. You can see sites that had chronic fire, and you can see sites that almost never burn over several centuries within this snapshot of the Willamette National Forest. This leads me to Alan Tepley's 2013 paper, where I thought he did a really good job of coring lots of different stands in the Willamette National Forest and coming up with that there are lots of different old growth development pathways in the region. So he didn't have fire scars, but he did have lots of cross-dated forest development histories. And what he saw is that there's likely lots of different development pathways related to chronic fire versus moderately frequent non-stand replacing fire and infrequent stand replacement fire. So you have lots of flavors of old growth in the Pacific Northwest that end with very different structure and composition. And that diversity is the product of a very diverse fire regime historically. So I think that's like Alan has gotten really close and provided something that's really helpful here to look into. I'm going to just move into the Coast Range quickly here. This was where things became really surprising for me. So the College of Forestry funded a study to reconstruct fire and forest development in the Coast Range this summer. And I really thought we were going to not find a lot of fire when we moved here. It's sort of something I bet I find more fire than people expect, but I didn't expect to find it here. And this is what we found for the Coast Range, only a few miles from the beach. So again, this is, I think I'm showing 14 different sites. The sites are on this 10-kilometer grid here. So for example, this circle here represents one site, and that site is LF03 on this graph. So 14 sites here. Each tree sampled gets its timeline. It has a circle. We have an establishment date, and then the red triangles indicate fire scars. What you can see here is that there was a lot of fire even in the Oregon Coast Range. One thing I'm really interested in is that there seems to be much higher fire frequency up until about 1800. And then a lot of the sites we have a period of lower fire frequency from late 1790s up until about 1850. And then they burn quite frequently from 1850 to about 1910. So again, what I'm seeing here is a dynamic fire return interval over time. There's centuries where it's quite frequent, and then evidence of time periods where there's not a lot of fire activity. So we're finding this not only in the Western Cascades, but also in the Oregon Coast Range now. I want to finish with a discussion about traditional burning and how important it was to the development of old growth forests and people and indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest. I'm often asked the question at the end of presentations, what amount of traditional burning or fire use do you see in your fire history reconstructions? And this is a very sensitive conversation, and it's also difficult to know what the source of fire is. So fire could be from lightning or it could be from traditional burning. And when you cut a fire scar, it's difficult to understand the source. However, at the same time, in different study sites, we are seeing pretty compelling evidence that indigenous knowledge and traditional burning and cultural fire regimes were a really important contributor to old growth development, healthy ecosystems, and the develop or forest ecology in general in the Pacific Northwest. So start by saying that traditional burning was essential to the production of food and textiles in the Pacific Northwest. So just some examples of different reasons for burning quite frequently. And then I'm going to move you guys to an example that sort of, it just shouts this site was a focal site for traditional burning. So this example is from a site in the Western Hemlock Zone in the Western Cascades. The photo on the left there is showing you ponderosa pine in the Hemlock Zone. You can see an old growth Douglas fir in the back. And then you can see this really thick cohort of small Douglas fir that established in the early 1900s. If you walked into this, you would think that you were on the east side of the Cascades in a dry forest, but you're actually on the west side of the Cascades. The figure on the right there is a stem map. And so I have the tree ages marked out for different trees. If it's a full circle, the tree is still alive. If it's open, it's dead. So this is a dead pine established in 1642. This is a live Douglas fir established in 1661. All of the small trees at this site, the small Douglas fir, are established from the late 1890s to about 1915. So there's been a tremendous change here because something happened. So what happened here? And this is what I got for a fire history at the site. This graph's a lot to unpack. On the y-axis, I have a summer precipitation index. It's basically saying how cool and wet it was in the summer versus hot and dry. So on this graph, the blue indicates cool and wet conditions, positive, and the hot and dry is indicated by red. My fires on this graph are represented by the blue circles. So you can see fire occurrence over time, and you can see whether fire happened in hot, dry summers or cool and wet summers. I also have a time period from 1800 to 1820 highlighted, in which you can see is there's not a lot of drought during that time period. And outside of sites like this, you rarely find fire from 1800 to 1820 in the Pacific Northwest. You might find one fire, but at this site, there were 9 fires during this cool, wet period. The next thing I point your attention to is this dashed line in 1856. So that's the time period where Native Americans in the region were tragically and forcibly removed to reservations. And you can see a profound shift in the fire regime at that time period. So we moved from having fire every 2 to 3 years and in cool, wet summers and hot, dry summers to having fire about every 15 years. And now it only occurs in the hot, dry summers. So there's a really profound influence on traditional burning that occurred at this site, and it's been removed from this site. And we've moved from a forest that was quite open with large old growth pine, Douglas fir and sugar pine, to a forest that is experiencing heavy mortality. So this is an old growth forest that's in pretty rough shape and pretty rough condition. So I sort of want to close this topic talking about the importance of traditional fire knowledge and respectfully engaging with indigenous knowledge holders about traditional fire knowledge, because I think it's a really important way to support healthy forest ecosystems and to support old growth. There's 4 really important R's here. We need to respect cultural integrity. We need to identify relevance to indigenous peoples when we're doing this research and partnering, and it needs to be about reciprocal relationships. So giving back and sharing in a responsible way. And as I continue to do this triggering work, it's becoming more and more clear to me how important this is to incorporate into our understanding of fire and forest development. So I'm going to finish the conversation with just some highlights of the research, some conclusions or takeaways. The first is that the complex habitat and old growth structure that we so appreciate in the Pacific Northwest is possible not because of the absence of fire in many cases, but probably because of non-stand replacing fire in parts of this region. I think James Johnson sort of summarized that better than me, and he said, it's not just time since high severity fire, it's time and fire that's contributing to the sort of really iconic and magnificent structure in our old growth Douglas-fir systems. Another key point, these forests have non-deterministic succession. Another way to say that is there are many different old growth development pathways. Alan Tepley really pointed us in that direction, and we hope with summarizing and writing papers on the data we have now, we can get an even better understanding of how different types of old growth develop. Just a quick photo tour here. The left side shows a site from the Umpqua National Forest that was chronically burned, so frequent fire throughout its development. It has multiple age classes of Douglas-fir, hemlock, and grand fir in one site. So really complex age structure and strand structure. The photo in the middle shows a stand that burned frequently in the 1500s and 1600s. Fire frequency decreased in the 1700s, and then there was a fire in 1847. And all the smaller hemlock that you're seeing in that middle photo established right after that fire in 1847. So a lot of times we think they're shade tolerant and they come in the absence of fire, but actually the multi-layered hemlock understory is the product of fire in that stand. The last picture on the right shows you a forest that's about 130 years old in the Oregon Coast Range, and that stand has never had fire. And what you see there is a very uniform stand of Douglas fir that's 130 years old. So it hasn't been diversified by fire at this point. Another major point coming out of the research is fire frequency is non-stationary, and we're seeing evidence that reburns are common. So what I'm saying here is after we have a high severity fire, you dramatically change the microclimate of the site and the fuels, and you increase the likelihood and range of conditions in which these sites will burn. So some research from the late 80s from AG and Huff, they looked at flammability over time across a chronosequence of stand ages. And you can see that flame length and rate of spread are much higher during the early seral or first 100 years of development in these forests. So if you have a completely open area, you have much lower humidity, much higher temperatures, and higher wind speeds throughout the year. And you also have shrub and grass fuels that are going to cure and support burning more quickly. So you see, this might be why we have a dynamic fire return interval over time in the system. As you get a mature canopy developing, you have a change in the understory. It becomes more ferns and things that aren't ready to burn. You have higher humidity, lower wind speed, cooler temperatures, and it's more resistant to fire. So hypothesis there on why we see non-stationarity in fire return intervals. There's lots of evidence for that reburn phenomenon in the Pacific Northwest. The Tillamook fire and the Yacolt fires provide great examples. Tillamook fire just kept reburning after the first high severity fire. The Yacolt fire, huge fire, has, I think, 19 reburns after the first big fire in 1902. So you sort of go from this area that's hardly burning to burning all the time in the Pacific Northwest with that change in structure. I think I'm there. I really want to thank everyone who's working super hard on this work at PNW and OSU. And with that, I'll move into questions. I have a starter. I don't know if we need it, but how do we model temporally dynamic fire regimes, and what do we do with the diversity of successional pathways that we're seeing as a product of this diversity in fire?
Thanks, Andrew. Just a simple question to open up the Q&A.
Sure.
No, I was saying that was just your simple question. I don't know if anybody sounds making a joke.
Okay, sorry.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. I'm sure with a group this large, there is definitely a bunch of folks out there that have something to say.
I'll go. Awesome job, Andrew. This is solid work. I guess, I think you're highlighting that, it's variable. based on location and how things have played out. I guess the question is, based on where we are today and thinking about the social dynamic of things, how can we do a better job of, communicating to people information like this, but to help people want to live more with fire and think about the social aspects, of fire? Because ultimately, these kinds of data, I think, are really helpful to, make a case or an argument that, hey, we've had places with a lot of fire and places with little fire, over, a long period of time. But in order to, recognize some of these social values that you're talking about, is what do we need to do to change that narrative and to get people, recognizing that we have to have more fire on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the most effective way for me is to engage with collaboratives and other stakeholder groups and present this information. Presentations are okay, but the best way is to do it in the field. There's something really effective about telling stories with cross sections. It's very tangible data. People can hold it in their hands. And we were presenting this to the Hood River and Wasco County collaboratives a couple weeks ago, and it really brings in a different engagement. So I think a walk in the woods with the samples is really effective. The other sort of larger issue I think we have is people are less and less connected to the places where they live, and they don't necessarily need to know very much about them. And that's a new experiment for people living in the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't that way in 1850. People were intimately informed with how the ecosystem around them functioned, and they depended on it. So we have this Western model of living and managing things that sort of takes people out of nature. And I think that's a big discussion of how we move forward with that, and a huge challenge.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
Hey, before anybody else leaves the office hour, I'm going to launch a poll really quick, but if that's annoying, just move it off the screen and then take it before you leave. So who's next? All right, Joe, go for it. Joe Merschel.
Hey, Andrew. Super cool work and great presentation, and thanks to LANDFIRE for hosting. I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of I get two questions really. Have you compared, and maybe you said this, but what your findings, how they compare to the estimated fire return intervals by either LANDFIRE or like the model PC2FM? And then my second question would be, what are your thoughts about how departed the modern vegetation conditions are compared to what the historical, what they were during your early fire records? So how different were these forests likely back then during these more frequent fire regimes than they are today, and how that might, I guess we find in some places we do work that, they're just so different that it's hard to compare hard to conceive what the historical conditions would have been. Thanks.
Yeah, so two great questions. I think the first is, how does this compare to different modeled estimates of fire frequency? I've been looking at LANDFIRE. There's also the I forget the acronym, the other model you mentioned. And then there's also the revision to the Northwest Forest Plan, which has another fire model. The LANDFIRE in some places is okay, but for example, the dry and moist hemlock types, it's often, I think, 75 years, 125 years, and then in the wetter places, it's 500 years. So it's way longer than what we're getting out of the fire scar records. And I think that's just, a reflection of not having fire scar records before. And so we've got to feed that into our understanding. So I think there's that to correct. And then there's an opportunity to really understand what we mean by frequent mixed severity and moderately frequent mixed severity. So that term is out there, and in other maps and models, what does moderately frequent mean? And then I'm running into this problem with fire return intervals not being that helpful. So you saw that there could be 125 years without fire, and then there could be 5 fires in 1 century. A mean becomes a problem rather than something you can give to somebody and give them something effective to do with it. So that's the other thing, is like, what is the new terminology for a place where the mean is not so helpful? The other part there is departure. I haven't wrapped my head around it. There's sites that look like the site that was burned really frequently, where you're just like, wow, this is obviously very changed. And as I drive around, I can see that reflected. You can quickly move into forests that clearly have really old and large hemlock within a pretty small geography. Fire was important in their development, and I haven't yet put together how they've departed without it. I think that there would be more cohorts in those stands that had came in over the last century, and more gaps and openings had fire continued. Another point that people have brought up is that in the early 1900s, the estimate for the amount of early seral forest in west of the Cascades was about 20% of the area. After the 2020 fires, we're only at 3%. So we have far less early seral forest in the Pacific Northwest than we did historically. And a lot of it is on private industrial land. So that's a totally different quality of habitat for a lot of species. I think I ran on too long there, so I hope that helps, and I'll answer another one.
Thanks, Andrew. Go ahead, Michael. And why don't you introduce yourself and let us know your affiliation? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Michael Case, forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Washington State. Andrew, awesome work. This is super cool. I'm wondering, as you were presenting, if maybe this necessitates an addendum to Jim Agee's fire ecology in the Pacific Northwest. But with that aside, I guess my question is, a lot of these systems are, you mentioned private land holdings, very, very common land ownership on the west side of the Cascade Crest, right? And fire can be really challenging given the amount of private land. And so I'm wondering, from a restoration perspective, if there are maybe some lessons learned. I'm thinking back to that image of the 130-year-old Doug-fir stand that you showed, and it looked very homogeneous in structure. I'm wondering if there are any lessons learned from this work based on the distribution and structure of some of these forests that we might be able to integrate into some of the silvicultural practices. And if you had any, off the top of your mind, I would love to hear some of those. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think my concern, and a shared concern with other people on the research team, is all about moving from very homogeneous stands to complex and diverse stands, and how we get there. So one thing we have a lot of on federal and state lands are plantations. And a lot of our model is maybe we thin them once, but that very artificial planting of Douglas-fir, where we controlled everything, is just going to gap its way and fall apart its way into old growth over the next 500 years. But a lot of the area, we're not seeing that's how it happened. So we probably need new silvicultural techniques to come in and change the development trajectory of those forests where we can't use fire, to get gaps and openings and diversity in species composition. That's just simply not happening there. One example I have is just to the west of Corvallis. There's old growth on BLM land, and across the road there's about a 60-year-old plantation, and you can see just how low the density of old tree stumps were and how open that forest was as it developed. And so you develop these Douglas-fir with huge crowns, massive branches, and that's not what we're growing in our plantations by design, right? We're trying to grow lumber. So we've set something up to do that, and it doesn't fit that if it just sort of sits there over the next few centuries, it's going to end up like the old growth it replaced. I think, sorry, that's pretty long-winded answer. But yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity to develop new silviculture and apply this to our plantations to put them on a recovery trajectory. It reminds me of the ICO work in dry forests that Derek Churchill was a part of, is that there's a way to redesign silviculture to restore a historical development trajectory. So.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the question, Michael. Todd had a question. Considering all the variability that this research has uncovered, would classic fire regime descriptors remain relevant and useful?
Great question. I'm struggling with that. I think the mean fire return interval is not useful for a lot of places on the west side. It's important to say that you can have a lot of fire within one time period, but it seems quite variable. And that's come up in the Umpqua National Forest, the Willamette, and the Coast Range, Mount Hood. Fire's been dynamic over time. My leading hypotheses are that it's a function of forest structure and age, also a function of climate, and then also a function of traditional burning. So you have all this variability that we've seen over time, and our old growth forests that are on the landscape today, that has been driven probably by those three factors: forest structure, climate, and people. And so I don't know if things will be the same in the future. We may get very different old growth in the future based on what the rate of fire is and what it looks like. And yeah, I don't know how to bin fire regimes and talk about them for the west side yet, but I think we'll need some new categories and classifications.
Great. Don has a question. Can you expand on the importance of that early seral in Pacific Northwest systems? You mentioned that we have a deficit compared to our estimates under the HRV.
Sure. So early seral habitat, pollinators, insects, lots of different bird species, elk, deer, bear. They all love these diverse early seral habitats that have snags and logs, and plus all these other species that are able to grow in the understory when they're freed from being in a forest canopy. So we really love the habitat that old growth forests provide, but there's amazing habitat provided by our early seral systems. And one idea I'm sort of wrestling with in my head is that we have this classic model of forest succession that puts early seral on one end of the spectrum and it puts old growth 500 years later, right? And so in our minds, there's something that is very apart in time and very apart in space. But I think historically, with a more active fire regime, you actually got old forest structures really close to early seral structures in space, and well distributed over time. So you're not waiting centuries and centuries to get the early seral in some part of the landscape. It's always there, it's shifting around, and it's often in space right next to old forest or mature forest. So I think that's one component we're losing with our current practices, is not only the early seral, but connecting it to other successional stages and other structures. It used to be very integrated and well distributed in time and space, and we're probably, we're creating big patches of old growth, and then big patches of high severity fire are mainly the effects we have on the landscape today. We have the 2020 fires, the Willamette and the southern Willamette and the Umpqua and Rogue have been burning quite frequently, but the rest of the region has not. So we're losing that diversity of structure and function.
Man, Andrew, we're not giving you any softball questions here.
I'll have a good nap after this.
Yeah. We still have a couple minutes. If anybody has any outstanding questions they want to chime in, go for it, Randy.
Andrew, again, thank you. And thanks to everyone for the great questions. I'm in the Great Lakes, so I'm just learning tons here. Thank you. I'm curious, you've mentioned succession classes, and as everybody probably knows, landfire biophysical settings models take a biophysical setting or a historical ecosystem, break it into succession classes, and then model how much each succession class would have been on the landscape by parameterizing each one of those succession classes or states with disturbance regimes, fire, beaver, flooding, drought, whatever the case may be. So it makes me wonder which succession class generically were you sampling in the most? Would it have been early, mid, late, or across all succession classes for these forest types? Or I feel like you've mentioned it and I probably missed it, but I was curious about that.
No, that's a great question. So we basically, this is a pretty random approach. So the only requirements were that it needed to be within 750 meters from a road, because we have to get in and take the samples out. And then the Westside fire study was random within national forests after that. So in the chart up here, you're seeing forests that established in the 1800s all the way back to the 12th century. So we have sort of sampled across a gradient of forest ages. We haven't done a lot in natural forests that would have established after fire, not logging, in the past century and a half. So that's a gap there. But we didn't structure the sampling by forest structure or predicted age. We just said, we're going out to these random locations on the map and building a fire history. And so that's sort of what the Willamette looks like. And the GP and the Mount Hood are similar. There's lots of different development histories and maximum tree ages across the sites we're sampling. It's sort of like you never know what you're going to get when you show up. And one thing I didn't mention is that speaks to not a lot of evidence for really huge high severity fires that reset the stage across a huge area. It may have happened, but after those high severity fires, there were additional burns. So over time, say there was a large fire event in say 1525 that was high severity across these sites, they've been broken up by other fires since then. So maybe it's there, but we're not seeing what you'd expect if it was all dominated by big high severity fires. If it was that way, you'd expect everything to have the same maximum tree age. But what you see here is a stair step and something new every time you go to a random site. It could be a different age. So good question.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Andrew.
Put
That
me
was
somewhere.
you did well with kind of actually kind of a dumb question, because after I said, I'm like, wait, you really can't get a historical fire regime from early succession because those trees weren't there historically. So it's kind of a conundrum of a question, but I am really curious about historical fire regimes in those early and mid succession classes, which must be really hard to get at. Maybe that's through soil charcoal or some other traditional ecological knowledge, that sort of thing. But thanks a lot for your answer. That's awesome.
Sure, no problem.
Maybe one final question to wrap up. Henry has a question about directions for the future. So where are you going next with your work and thinking about the landscapes across the United States where we should be doing more detailed work like this?
Sure, great question. I think the next directions for this study are to get into more fine-scaled sampling of forest development. So we have these different fire regimes on the chart now. Now let's go back to those sites, put in additional tree coring plots, and see how those fires contributed to the development of forests over time, and sort of revise and expand the model that Alan Tepley has over a bigger scale. I think it's possible that what Alan Tepley has there works really well in the Willamette. And then if you move to the Mount Hood or the GP or the Coast Range, you might need a different set of models. So that's where I hope to go. I think it'll take years and years to sort of get there. So we're just sort of biting off chunks at a time. In terms of other places that need fire history, I really see the Pacific Northwest, all the way across the border as areas that are ripe for more learning. Other people on the call, Joe and others probably know of other areas in the United States. But I have been lucky in that, I was in Corvallis and then started looking into it, and I was like, wow, there's really not a lot of fire history in this region that's cross-dated, but I'm not quite sure. But definitely lots more to do in the Pacific Northwest.